Hi everyone, this is Bachushki and I'm making a report on my last 2 weeks of progress. It's been a very productive 2 weeks. I was traveling for work but still managed to get quite a bit of game development time. As per my previous process, I'm following a weekly sprint cycle. So for those of you familiar with different methodologies for development, I follow a very simple Agile methodology where I set a weekly sprint, and every week I choose things from my backlog that I want to work on and try to accomplish those goals during the week. And whatever I don't accomplish moves to the next sprint or moves back into the backlog. So every week I'm doing a sprint, and then every 2 weeks I'm reporting out on YouTube, kind of using all of you as a way to pretend that I have a team of people to tell what I've worked on and what I'm going to work on. This process is working out pretty well for me. It gives me a goal every Sunday night to finish a certain number of things. And I also make sure that I try not to get stuck. So if I do get stuck with something, I leave it and come back to it later. And try not to take too seriously, if something slips from my scope because I'm not able to figure it out or accomplish it, it's okay. I'll come back to it, and that way I keep moving and keep making progress. So in my first week, I created a sprint called Environment. So the purpose of that sprint was to create the environment. I had a placeholder kind of soil that I had created, or like a surface, but I wanted to experiment with all kinds of things there. I wanted to be able to create more interesting terrain. I wanted to do what's called splat mapping, which is painting the terrain. And I wanted to place my first bushes and trees and sky to have clouds. So I did that. I used Xylan's terrain plugin for Godot. And if I look at the end of that environment process, I was able to modify the terrain using the painting tools. I was able to paint it with a simple color palette. I think this is 3 different colors. So a soil color, grass, and then a sort of infertile or stony soil. And I was able to place trees as well with this scatter plugin from the same author. And that worked out pretty well. As you'll see later, I ended up abandoning this particular approach, but it was good for me to learn how to manipulate the terrain using that tool. I also worked on my art style and on the graphical settings for the project. So I have a couple of things that are priorities for me. One thing that I'd say is a priority from an art style perspective is simplicity. So I really like simple, clean lines. I like to be able to clearly see the object that I'm looking at, and not have it obscured by too much detail or too fine of detail. So you can see that the art style that I kind of am going for is, I wouldn't say super low poly, but it's low poly-ish. And it's definitely stylized. I kind of call it my Playmobil style because it's based on the Playmobil toys that many of you might be familiar with. So very simple, clean lines, simple colors, not a lot of detail. And you can see in terms of the house that I built, I have a certain style, so it's sort of a pudgy, chubby look for the building. So they kind of bulge outward, and they have a lot of irregular lines, so not a lot of straight lines. I did experiment with all kinds of textures and different ways of doing this, and what I landed with was a very simple color palette. Some of you might be familiar with the YouTuber Infenzia, and Infenzia shows how he uses a very simple palette of colors to create lots of models. And although he has a slightly different style, I'm using more of a smoothed style. I'm using the same kind of approach for my color scheme. So all of these colors are based on a very, very simple 128 color palette. I'm very interested in making sure that my game is not aliased. If you know what aliasing it is, it means that there's sort of these little edges, sharp edges, and they don't look well when you're moving around a 3D game. So I made sure to explore the aliasing settings in Godot. There's 2 different ways of aliasing, an MSAA and an FSAA, and I'm using a mixture of both, even with a low-end machine that I'm testing on, which works great and looks good. At this point, at the end of this sprint, I had a camera that was modified as well, so you might notice that now if I'm pointing at the terrain and I rotate, it rotates around whatever point in the terrain matches the center of my camera. So it does a ray cast, finds the terrain, and then it rotates around that point. And it works pretty well, so my movement is pretty good, and the rotations are pretty good. There's still some problems with terrain clipping, so if I push myself down really quickly, I hit the terrain, but then my center point zooms out to the edge of the screen, which is super annoying. And that's still not fixed even in the second sprint that I did. You have to kind of move and scroll forever back. Another problem with the camera that's still not fixed is the zoom. So it's really slow to zoom in when you're far away, but then when you're close, it's too fast. Like the zoom is very jerky. So I need to fix that so that the zoom slows down as it approaches the terrain and speeds up as it's further away. At this point, I think I was experimenting with the skybox, but I ended up taking it out because it was a huge performance hit. I had imported this skybox time of day add-on, and it was beautiful, but it probably didn't match the art style, and it was really non-performant on my slower machine that I'm testing on. So I took that out. So I will add back the sky and the clouds at some point, but at the moment I just have a solid color. My second sprint was much more challenging, so I called this sprint Settlers because I intended to have an agent or a settler, a villager if you will, that could move around the terrain. I quickly realized that this was actually quite complicated because I needed to learn all about navigation and pathfinding, which I had some exposure to when I was working with Unity, but having to learn it in Godot. At the time I was in Godot version 3.44, which is a very basic navigation engine, and I quickly realized I needed to upgrade to 3.5, which is still a release candidate version, but I did upgrade to 3.5 without any issues. There's almost no differences. It was just additional functionality in the navigation features. And I created what's called a navmesh, and I found out that it's actually a little bit tricky to do the navigation in 3.5. And after probably 3 days of banging my head against the navmesh and the navigation system in 3.5, I think there may still be a couple of bugs in there. I had a lot of trouble getting the navigation system to work with my terrain. My terrain is, not flat. A lot of the developers with Godot, I think, have pretty flat terrain or even completely flat terrain. So this nav mesh, which you can see on top of my terrain, it was just causing all kinds of issues for my agent to move around. And I also didn't fully understand at that time how to move my agent correctly. I didn't understand how to give gravity to a kinematic body. And it took me a couple of days to realize that my kinematic body had no gravity. And that's why they were kind of cruising around through the atmosphere and not sticking close to the ground. Once I did give them gravity, that's when I found all the issues with the navigation server in 3.5 and tweaked so many different settings, tried so many different configurations. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. And so I ended up going back to a very simple approach. And my simple approach is just to use the navigation server. So there's this navigation node that kind of gives you a few features, and then you have a navigation mesh underneath that, which is just a sort of like an invisible copy of the terrain mesh, which is used for navigation. I get that navigation node and I get what's called a simple path. So it just calculates and says, hey, I'm trying to go from here to here. How do I get there? And it returns a list of waypoints where the agent needs to go, one after the other. And that worked pretty well. So what I did is I took that simple path and I adjusted it so that the path itself was exactly on my terrain. This was the issue that I was having in 3.5, is that the navigation agent was not close enough to my terrain. And so what was happening is that sometimes it could tell that it had gotten to a waypoint, but other times it would be too far on the y-axis from its waypoint. And there is a setting in 3.5 to adjust this so that the navigation agent ignores the y-axis, but it wasn't working. So I had to create my own function here to basically adjust each waypoint down to the terrain. But that was a super labor-intensive and kind of intimidating user story because I really didn't know anything about navigation. My movement script was kind of wrong. And so it took a ton of experimentation, and I'm still not sure I fully understand everything that's going on there, but at least I have a working model. When I opened up the project in this sprint on my slower laptop, it was like 7 or 8 FPS. So I decided to completely redo my approach, and I actually stripped out all of the add-ons that I had added before. So Xylan's Terrain, I said, you know what, I'm going to take this out and see if I can improve the performance. And it really did improve the performance. So taking out just that add-on added a load of FPS. I recreated the mesh using Blender. So I just sculpted a new mesh using Blender. If you're not familiar with Blender, it's an amazing tool and you really need to learn it. The only issue with this mesh is that it has to render the entire mesh all at once. So this entire mesh is being rendered at full level of detail. Xylan's Terrain does what's called chunking. So it does level of detail chunking, which means that as you get further away from a part of the terrain, it kind of lowers in detail. I'll eventually figure out how to do that with my own meshes, but for now this is performing much better, even though it's having to render the entire mesh. I also had to learn how to repaint the terrain. So this was a very interesting process, and I actually was super happy that I ended up creating my own terrain and having to code it all from scratch, because it gave me the opportunity to learn about shaders and splat maps in a much more detailed way. So on my terrain, which is a mesh, I have created a spatial shader, and that spatial shader is pretty simple, but basically it creates a bunch of slots for me to put in different textures. So at the moment, my textures are very basic. I have soil, sand, and stone, so 3 different textures with no normal maps or anything. It's just a solid color. And then I created these maps using paint.net. So my soil map, my stone map, my sand map, and then a moisture map. So I load the different soil maps in there in the UI. And basically what I do is I pull one of the colors out from each map. So like soil is based on the, this is RGB, right? So divided by 2.55 just means that in paint.net, you can set a color index from 0 to 255. But within the shader, it seems to recognize colors better if they're from a 0 to 1 scale. So I just divided by 2.55 to get the correct scale. I get the alpha channel, which is the transparency. So the strength of the soil is dependent a little bit on the color. So the higher the color value, the more soil there is, but also the alpha. It can fade off as it overlaps with other layers. And then what I do is I take the green color out of that soil map, and however strong the green color is, that's how strong the soil effect is, or the dirt color is in my map. I'm setting specular, which is kind of shininess. So these two settings seem to adjust the shininess of the models. So if you set specular lower and roughness higher, you get a model that doesn't shine as much, because I was getting these issues where it kind of looked like super shiny plastic. But the shader is really cool because it runs for every pixel on the map. So it was really fun to learn about shaders. I'm really excited to use shaders more as I go forward in the game. So the terrain is being painted by the shader and combining all those different maps. So you've got, deep, moist soil in the valley, and then less so on the hills. And it doesn't look amazing, but it's a start. It's more to prove the technical aspects of the game. I did the same thing with trees. So again, before I was using a scatter plugin from Xylan to do the trees, and I didn't really understand how it was working. So I went back and I built my own code to populate the trees. So what I did is I modeled 3 simple trees. I looked into different ways of populating the trees. I looked into something called the Poisson disk distribution algorithm, but it seemed overly complicated. I've created a variable that takes a texture. So this is my tree map. So I've just painted certain areas in paint.net on the terrain, and that's where I want my trees to be. My tree manager loops through a grid on that terrain, or on that image. So for example, in this case, I'm looping through a certain width based on the size of the tree. And I loop through that grid, and if the pixel, so here I get the pixel in an image, if the pixel has a certain color, which in this case is green, and the alpha is greater than 0, meaning it's not totally transparent, then I do some random logic. So I randomize the position within that square on the grid. So instead of all my trees being exactly, in lines, it just adds a random number to the X and Y axis. Also randomly scales the tree, it randomly rotates the tree, and it also changes the size of the tree depending on the alpha channel of my map. So if there's a solid color on my map, then it creates a full-size tree. If there's a less than solid color at the edges of the forest, it creates smaller trees. And as the alpha increases, it's more likely that the trees will be closer together. It didn't actually take me very long to figure out how to do this, and it didn't require any crazy math or anything like that. So the trees scatter based on my map, and then you can see that they get thinner on the edges of the forest, which is exactly the effect that I wanted. Now I don't have any level of detail enabled for the trees, so all of the trees are being rendered that you can see here, which is a lot, right? You can see that I have like 10,000 objects being rendered, and that's not ideal because on lower spec machines, or even on this machine, once I actually have a game running in here, you don't want to be rendering all the trees at full detail. And I will work on some way of doing level of detail at some point, but at the moment it's on this machine. I'm on my faster one this morning. It's performing just fine. And I can show you the agent as well. So this is the pseudo settler. So you can see there's a target that he's going towards. And these white balls that appear above the terrain are the waypoints. So as he gets closer to each waypoint, you can see he's navigating to different places. After working on this, I was actually kind of doubting whether I even want to have actual people in my game. So this is all prototyping, obviously, but if I do continue to develop this game, I'm not sure that I want people. I kind of want this game to be a higher scale game. So imagine this terrain would be a region and there would be little villages along. So it would be kind of at a higher level, maybe halfway between what Foundation does and what Civilization does. Civilization, you know, there's not really any people. There's like units that you can move around, but there's no like individuals. And I'm kind of envisioning something for this game along those lines, but we'll see. I did some additional 3D models, so I have 2 houses and a shop now. So the house is the same one from last week. I have a second house, which is just a variation of the first one, a little bit bigger, different colors, different style of window. And then I have my shop. So this should give you some idea of the art style that I'm going for at the moment, which is always subject to change, but you can see kind of, again, what I was saying about the buildings being sort of irregular, not a lot of straight lines, you know, pretty typical low poly style, but I'm pretty happy with that. And it's working with the load system, so my save and load still works. So this is just the saved environment, so it just reloads the buildings that I had in there in the save. I think they look really well. I think the graphics look great. The trees need a little bit more detailing. I don't want to make them too detailed though, because I want to keep this very simplistic color palette and simplistic from a performance perspective as well. I want to make sure my trees are super performant because there's going to be a lot of trees. This map is 512 pixels wide, which is probably about right for a single settlement. But obviously when I zoom up to different levels, I'm going to need trees that are pretty performant, so keeping them low poly is important. And from a performance perspective, I learned this week that I need to always test on both my machines, so my really good gaming machine as well as my not so good laptop. And by doing that, I'll kind of identify those performance issues early and make sure that I'm not going down a path that's going to just completely not work for, you know, a lot of users who play the game. From a coding perspective, I'm getting more and more confident with Godot. I actually really love GDScript. I'm so happy that they have a native scripting language that you can use instead of C# or C++. So what do we have going forward? So the next sprint I'm calling Land and Labor, and the idea is that I have kind of a few things that I want to change about the current approach just to experiment. So I want to change the building system. So I have this building system now that it imports in real time the buildings from a GLTF file, which is a 3D modeling file. That's kind of clunky, and I'm just going to move the buildings into their own nodes. So I'm going to work on the camera again for the millionth time. I'm going to work on what I call a grounding component. So if a building is on a hill, an example would be this shop here, the door needs to go down, right? You can see that the door is above the level of the ground. So a grounding component will just be attached to any part of a building that needs to go down to the ground. And when it's placed, that door will slink down to the ground so that it's positioned correctly. It's something that I'm familiar with from Foundation modding. So then I want to do building splats. So what I mean by that is when a building is placed, I want there to be sort of an area around the building that's discolored on the terrain to indicate that people are, you know, walking around the building, and also to set the building off a little bit on the soil. And then the two big cards, which are going to be quite interesting and possibly quite challenging, are households and land divisions. This game is going to be based on land, so what I need to do is I need to divide the land up into plots. So an example would be you might draw a plot here, and you'd say, okay, I'm going to assign this plot to so-and-so household. So the household is going to be the basic building block of the population. So it might be a mother and father with children, it might be an extended family, it might be an individual, it might be just a collection of single people who don't have a family connection but who all work on the same plot. You can imagine like a manor or a workshop tailor, let's say in a village, would have a plot of land, and they might grow a little bit of food on that plot, they might have their workshop, they're going to have their house. The house and the workshop might be the same building. So everything's going to start with households and land, and the idea is that you're going to separate out the land into plots. They could be huge, they could be small. You're going to assign a household to the plot, and that household is going to change over time, but essentially they're going to build a house there. They're going to work there because, in this time, this is sort of a Middle Ages / early modern period. People tended not to work away from home, right? Most people were working at home. So even if you were a professional, like a tailor or a butcher, your house and your workplace were the same place. So that's not always going to be true, but for the beginning part of the development, what I want to do is just assign a household to a plot of land, and the household will work that plot of land to create food or their own living. And the economy will be based around those households and land plots. So I don't have it all fully fleshed out in my head yet, but I do know that I definitely want to have this land ownership system. That's going to be quite interesting to try to figure out. It's a little bit like my garden application that I was working on, where I have to draw different polygons and assign them to things, but I'm a little more confident now that I can do it. The households themselves are going to be virtual at this time, so it's just going to be data that I'm going to be assigning to the plot of land. There's not going to be actually people walking around just yet. And yeah, so wish me luck on that, and hopefully in 2 more weeks I'll come back with some of those things finished, as well as another sprint that I haven't planned out yet. Thanks for watching, and appreciate any comments or suggestions that you may have. I'm really enjoying my learning journey, and I hope some of you are taking inspiration to start your own projects from the work that I'm doing here.